This is Rob Tebbutt for Boxing Social in association with Betfred. Privileged to be joined here today by legendary Cutman Jacob Stitch Duran. We're here at the City Gym in Las Vegas. How are you, Stitch?
I'm doing great, man. Just finished a great workout here with JJ. I'm pumped, man. I love doing what I'm doing here with him as his Cutman, and to work with the team. It's been a phenomenal experience for me.
You've worked with kind of a who's who of boxing, MMA legends, kickboxing legends, so to speak. This is something a bit different, even for you, who's kind of been there, seen it and done it. Just tell us a little bit about working with KSI before his rematch with Logan Paul.
Yeah, Amir Abdallah called me. I had worked with Vidal Riley when he made his pro debut and asked me to be the cut man. And, I didn't know anything about, KSI. I didn't know anything about Logan Paul, but I liked the scenario. And I was talking to Michael Buffer during the Triple G fight, and he said, man, it was phenomenal, just to be part of it. And for me to be part of it and working with JJ, a.k.a. KSI, to me is a privilege. And, I've had a lot of historical moments in my life, Robert. This one definitely falls up on top.
How does it compare with working with the greatest of respect to JJ, working with kind of the elite level professionals that you've worked with throughout your career?
Well, he's a fighter. As I wrap his hands every day, I always try to give him that, that fatherly speech and, the experience that I have. And, I told him, I said, I don't look at you as a rapper, I look at you as a fighter. And he's definitely accomplishing that. So it's a different experience, man, but I'm glad to be part of the team. It's kind of crazy, yeah.
It certainly is. I mean, I just watched him do his workout and watched him sparring him. It's a little bit surreal even for me, so God knows what it's like for you. It's kind of unexpected to really come across you today, so I've got lots of things that I'd like to ask you. Tell us a little bit about how you got started in. I know you're not just a boxing Cutman, as I mentioned, you do MMA and various other combat sports, but you're from a marketing background from way back when. Tell us a little bit about how you came into combat sports.
Well, you must have read my book, From the Fields to the Garden. It's on Amazon.com. But, I always wanted to play professional baseball. I grew up as a farm worker, obviously because of economics, never had the opportunity. But I joined the Air Force in 1972, and 1974 they stationed me in a place called Thailand. I didn't know what the hell Thailand was, and saw my first Muay Thai fight. And that whole year I literally got into the martial arts and studied that, and got back into the States, got into boxing to improve my hands, and started training amateur boxers at that time and opened up Mount School of Kickboxing. And, I was a trainer, I promoted fights, I managed fighters, and but I was also a cut man for economics. And that just kind of floated to the top, Robert. So like 24 years ago, I packed up my family, came to Las Vegas. As I say, if you're an actor, you go to Hollywood. If you're in boxing, you come to Las Vegas, and I came here to follow my dreams, and you can see dreams do come true.
How is it that you ended up, you've just mentioned kind of promoting, managing, how is it that you ended up specifically working on cuts? Was it just something that you were naturally good at? Was it something that particularly took your fancy? How did you land on that?
That's a good question. I was a good trainer. When I came to Las Vegas, I didn't come to be a trainer because I thought all the great trainers in the world were here in Las Vegas. But as I'm in the gyms, I am looking at these guys train. I could do that, and I could do that. And I had an 8-to-5 job. I worked a corporate America job, but I would get off work and get into the gyms, and they would hire me to do pads. And, I've done pads for Mike Tyson, Johnny Tapia, Raul Marquez, a lot of Mike McCallum, the legendary Mike McCallum, and but I always had a job. But when I came already as experienced as a cut man through kickboxing. So when I came, my first big fight was Raul Marquez when he fought Keith Mullins for the IBF middleweight title. Raul ended up with like 5 big cuts, here, something like 70 stitches. I kept him in the game, and that was my coming out fight, here in Las Vegas, and people started taking notice, and, took me up to this level now.
When you're a cutsman and you're in the corner, do you hope that you don't have to be used throughout a fight, or do you kind of what's that experience like? When you see somebody get cut, is it like, okay, it's my turn now, or what's that like?
Well, it's a good question. You get good questions, man. I always prepare for worst case scenario, and I worked with Shakir Stevenson over the weekend. I didn't do anything, and I just kind of didn't know what to do, so it was kind of nice. But I look at myself as an insurance policy. You drive a Ferrari, your insurance gets a little bit higher. But yeah, I'm always prepared for the unexpected, prepared for the worst case scenario. But when it happens, yeah, of course, there's a little bit of excitement, a little bit of adrenaline rush to go in there. And, when a fighter wins a fight, I know I had something to do with it. That's what I get off on. That's my accomplishments.
What makes a good cut man?
Composure. I get that question all the time. I get emails and texts and messages. Everybody wants to be a cut man. because they see what I do. But I tell them it takes, you got to spend hours and days and weeks and months and years in the gym, working with fighters, learning how to be a fighter, not only the physical aspect, but the mental aspect. But composure is really number one. Having all the proper tools and knowing how to use them and when to use them. And just having the technique that I've established. You see a lot of the guys in the MMA industry that are using it. And I'm the kind of guy, when I was learning to be a cutman, years before when I lived in California, this guy did a good job on the cuts, and I asked him what he did, and he says, F you, I'm taking this to my grave, and you got to learn like me. He walked away. I felt about this big, Robert. But I just enforced that I don't want to be like this guy. My job is to teach. So, I've done seminars. I've helped guys out, showing them how to wrap hands and, just taking care of the fighters because, you as a coach would show a fighter how to fight, but nobody shows the coach how to take care of the fighter. And I think as I leave my legacy, that's the legacy I want to leave.
You work across various different combat sports. What's the difference? Is there a difference, or is a cut, or is a fight?
Yeah, really a cut is a cut and a fight is a fight, But, what makes it so exceptional and what I do is to get in the inner soul of these fighters. And that, to me, that's such a privileged position to be in because even though these guys are modern-day gladiators, deep inside they're babies. And Vladimir Klitschko, when he fought Anthony Joshua, I'll give you a little bit of behind-the-scene scoop. I didn't see Vladimir till Friday because my daughter had gotten married Wednesday in Crete. So in the weigh-ins, and I've been with Vladimir many years, I put my hand on his shoulders and I said, "Little Vladimir, don't worry about nothing tomorrow. I'm going to take care of you like you're my son." And I left it. That's the psychological aspect. Well, here we are right before Michael Buffer does the announcements, 90,000 people at Wembley Stadium. He looks at me as I'm putting the final Vaseline on him, and he says, "You could call me son." So I knew I got into his head, and as he said, it was one of the greatest fights he's ever been involved in.
That was a great fight that night in front of 90,000 people at Wembley Stadium. What was that experience like for you? I mean, of course, Vladimir Klitschko was cut in that fight.
Yeah.
I'll see you soon, man.
One love.
In the bed, man.
Good man right here, man. It's a pleasure working with this guy, man.
Baby,
I told him from the get-go, man, in the ring he's going to be my son. So I'm gonna
Thanks,
take care of
Dad.
him. Of course, brother. One love. Good job, brother. Yeah, good kid, man. And those are the things I get off on is working with good people. It's never been about economics. It's about accomplishments for me, because I grew up as a farm worker, and to reach these high pinnacles and to work with guys like JJ is tremendous.
Back to that night at Wembley Stadium.
Yes.
What was going for you? I mean, that was one of the best atmospheres that I've certainly been involved with as a British boxing fan, even. What was that like for you that night in Wembley Stadium?
It was, I've always said 90,000 Brits is like 150,000 somewhere else. The Brits were tremendous. And when Anthony Joshua walked out, it was so loud that it just buzzed. Bzzz, just so many people. But what was very respectful was at the end of the fight, the people were cheering Vladimir as well as they were cheering Anthony Joshua. And I told Vladimir, I said, this was like when Rocky fought his last fight, when he lost, but he was walking out and the people were around, Rocky. The same thing happened to Vladimir, but what an experience, man. I've been all over the world and I've done a lot of fights, but that one really had to sit on top as the best one I've ever been involved in.
I mentioned earlier on kind of Mike Tyson and Johnny Tapia, two of my favourite fighters and two very, I'd say probably certainly when Mike Tyson was fighting, and obviously certainly the late Johnny Tapia, troubled souls away from the ring. What were they like to work away from the cameras? How was your relationship with them as people?
Well, Johnny Tapia, Mike Tyson, I would just want to do one day of pads because I was very good at doing pads. I ended up doing like a week and a half when he had left his trainer and came back, and then Freddie Roach came on. So I had a chance to break sweat with him, but I've worked with some of Mike's fighters. And behind the scenes, they're dynamite people. Johnny Tapia really had a heart of gold. I remember one time we were driving out of the gym, and all these homeless people are sitting up against the fence, and he stopped and gave them all $20 each. That was the kind of guy that Johnny Tapia was, and a lot of respect for him.
What's the worst cut you've ever worked on?
I've worked tons of them, bro. In MMA, they happen all the time. I'm doing bare knuckle fights. Jason Knight that fought Artem Lobov that fought Paulie Malignaggi. A picture I took of him, I counted 10 cuts that had to be sewn. I saw him at the Artem show when he fought Paulie, and he had 12 cuts. But big cuts, in MMA, they happen all the time. That Tyson Fury cut is something that I've worked on a regular basis, so I'm accustomed to those type of cuts.
You mentioned bare knuckle fighting. That's something that's really, well, not just come about, but it's really been introduced to the mainstream in the last 18 months, 2 years. You mentioned Artem Lobov, Paulie Malignaggi. What's that like for a Cutman to be involved in something that's virtually guaranteed to spill some blood somewhere along the line?
It's about a 60-70% cut ratio. Yeah, it's guaranteed. And to me, Dave Feldman that promotes bare knuckle fighting, it was a good choice in him, to bring me in because when I first heard about it, the only reason I accepted the challenge was to see the safety that was involved in taking care of these fighters, because for me, safety is paramount. And everything that they did is they maximize the safety of fighters. And, they're going to get cut, they're going to get broken hands, but, that's part of the challenge of them fighting bare knuckle fights. But the mental game is entirely different than it is in boxing or MMA. You literally have to cross that line.
You're one of, if not the most established Cutman across all combat sports. How often does somebody ring you up and say, Stitch, I need somebody this weekend. Stitch, I need somebody tomorrow night. Stitch, I need somebody on the 28th, etc.? Well,
I've had 5 weeks straight that I've worked. I've been gone. I was with Tony Yoka in Paris. I did Triple G. I was in Chicago when this poor kid passed away. Did the bare knuckle fights, and this weekend Shakir Stevenson. I'll be working the Canelo fight. Virgil Hunter just called me, but I'm booked all the way to New Year's Eve. I'll be working with Vidal Riley and Badu Jack on the 28th in Atlanta, and then from there I go straight to Tokyo and finish up my year with Kazuto Okada. So it's been a good run for me, bro.
Kazuto Okada is one of my favourite fighters, my favourite current fighters. Talk to me a little bit.
You know your game, don't you?
Yeah, I try. Talk to me a little bit about working with him. Of course, one of Japan's many leading fighters that are currently in the sport.
Yeah, and I also worked with the Kameda brothers, which is kind of nice. They're big legends in Japan, and I used to go to Japan all the time for Pride, and it's nice to go back to Japan when the Japanese people call you Stitch-san, hey, Stitch-san, Stitch-san. But Kazuto was I just saw him in the gym the other day. He came back to train in Las Vegas with Salas, and the Japanese are just so humble, so good people. He brings me a box of chocolates, and you just don't see that all the time.
Now, I'm in Las Vegas this week for Canelo Alvarez versus Sergey Kovalev, 2 fighters I'm sure you're very, very familiar with.
Yeah.
What do you make of that fight?
Oh yeah, I'm glad to be there. I'm looking forward to watching it. I think it's going to be a barn burner. I think it's going to be, I look at fights not who's going to win, who's going to lose. I look at it, what are the probability of someone getting cut, and if you ask my opinion on that, I think, I don't know who Kovalev's going to use as a cut man, but I think he'll probably have his work cut out for him, quote unquote.
When you're looking at a fight, that's a very interesting way of kind of looking at a fight and breaking it down. When you're looking at it, what constitutes, okay, he's likely to get cut? I know sometimes it can be due to somebody's weight cut. I mean, so somebody who cuts a lot of weight can be more susceptible to cuts, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong. Talk to me about what makes a cut fighter, as it were.
It's technique. It's technique and aggressive. How aggressive a fighter is. What kind of defense he's going to have. I know Canelo's going to come forward. Kovalev is going to come forward. I know Canelo got cut, in one of his fights. So, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if both cut men are used.
So as well,
and you were talking about dehydration and all that. Does that make a difference? I don't know if it does or not. There's a lot of myths in boxing, Robert. These guys have time to hydrate. They have 24 hours to hydrate, so I don't know if that's going to be an issue. I know in the old days, Julio Cesar Chavez would sit out in the sun and let that sun dry up his skin. But as you know the game now, something that's a little bit more softer and moist is less likely to get cut than if you have dry skin. For example, a branch. If you have a dry branch, you get it and you bend it, it's going to break. But if you have one that's moisturized, you could bend it, probably twist it into a pretzel. So that's the theory behind that.
Obviously, a Cutman is part of a corner team, which is obviously headed up by the chief second, the trainer. Talk to us about the trainers that you've worked with over the years. I'm sure you've worked with some of the greats.
I have, many of the greats. Of course, Emanuel Steward, Lou Duva. I've worked with Virgil Hunter, Salas. I've worked with so many of the great guys, and just to work with them and be part of their history, to me is tremendous. And like I say, when I started working with Wembley Klitschko, Emanuel Steward was commentating for HBO, and we're at the MGM, and he walks by, and as I'm watching the fans walk in, and he looks at me and says, Stitch, I want to talk to you about working with Vladimir. And that's Emanuel Steward, right? Next day he called me and offered me the position, and what a great challenge for me.
I'm always fascinated to speak to people who have worked with Emanuel Steward, the late great Emanuel Steward.
Yes.
Spoken to Andy Lee about it on several occasions.
Yes,
Lennox Lewis, of course. Just what type of person was he, and how influential was he? not necessarily on your own career, but also on the fighters around him?
Tremendous. And such a humble guy. I used to go host a radio show in Vegas called The 13th Round, and Emanuel never turned me down every time I called him. And I was nobody at that stage, right? But working with him, I remember the best corner, best fight I ever worked when Vladimir Klitschko fought Samuel Peter. And he got dropped, 3-4 times or something like that. Emanuel kept him in the game and kept him composed and all that, and went on, got a victory. But I've learned so much off of him. And God, me and him and Vitaly just worked like clockwork, and that's the way it should be.
And another name that you just mentioned there, Lou Duva, who people who are watching the channel may not be as familiar with Lou Duva's work, the late Lou Duva's work, as they were with Emanuel Steward. Lou, one of boxing's big characters. What was it like working with him?
He was a character, man. Just as a person, he was fun. It was great. We did his reality show. There was a reality show that Oscar De La Hoya put together, and I got to work with him. And to me, it was just fun. He was just a fun guy to work with, and very astute in the game. Very aggressive in the game, definitely in the corner, So talk about keeping your composure. He was one of the guys that never kept his composure, but he always did it for the fighter.
Okay, well, just finally before we let you go, hopefully people have enjoyed watching this interview as much as I've enjoyed doing it. What would you have said to yourself? You just mentioned from the farm to the garden. Yeah. What would you have said to yourself back when you were on that farm? If you were to say to yourself, one day you're going to be working in Las Vegas, you're going to be looking after some of the top fighters, being part of some of the top corners in the sport, would you have believed it?
I always had a dream. I knew down the road I was going to be a professional in something. I always thought it was going to be American baseball. But even now, I've done hundreds of shows, and I still pinch myself and saying, I'm that little kid that was a farm worker. And I always tell people, follow your dreams because they do come true. But it blows my mind. Here I am with KSI, going to be the main event on the zone. In a big fight with Billy Joe Saunders and Devin Haney on the undercard, and we're doing a 6-rounder, so for me to be in these kind of positions, it still blows my mind. I'm still that little kid that has accomplished so much, and in Spanish we have a saying, si se puede, it could be done, so I'm just warming up, bro.
Do you need that? Do you need that little kid in you in boxing to kind of be around the sport for as long as you have? Do you kind of need that little kid inside of you?
I think so. That's a good question, man. My daughter just put out a tweet the other day. She goes, my dad's been in the game like 40 years, and I guess she was looking at a cut that they had in the bare knuckle fights, and he's sitting there with a smile on his face and looking like he's having a great time. I am having a great time. Just to be in that position, working with so many great gladiators at these high-level events. Still blows my mind.
Okay, well, Jacob Stitch-Duran, thanks very much for speaking to Boxing Social, both on and off camera. Been a real pleasure meeting you for the first time. A little bit surreal. I've seen probably hundreds and hundreds of fights that you've been a part of, but thank you very much for speaking to Boxing Social, and hopefully we can catch up again soon.
Oh, I'm sure we will, Robert. I appreciate the questions, man. I tell you, you've been around the game. We're sitting down before we even started chatting, and you're bringing up names and events and all that kind of surprised me. So props to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for speaking to Boxing Social.
Cheers.
Thank you. That was great.
That was good. Thanks.